In 1989, the original Game Boy was released, and the rest is history when it comes to Nintendo and handheld devices, as that system spanned all of the 90s into the early 2000s before we got to the Game Boy Advanced. I know there's talk around the Game Boy Color being its own separate system, but Nintendo views it as one long run for this device, and they came out with several accessories that, ironically enough, worked to make it less and less pocket-sized. But there was one revision that Nintendo released, and it was for the Super Nintendo, that being the Super Game Boy. Well, there was actually a follow-up to the Super Game Boy, and it was creatively named the Super Game Boy 2. And that's what we're going to take a look at here today. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel. Now, the Game Boy itself was remembered for its library of titles, and that's basically what separated it from the more technologically advanced Game Gear from Sega. I mean, if you look at the Game Boy and the screen, and it wasn't great, but the games were. I mean, it's Nintendo, so you had classics like Mario and Kirby and Metroid, but even Tetris, for example, was an awesome experience there on the device. But it wasn't, to me, until Pokemon released that just everything exploded on that system. And then you couldn't go anywhere without seeing someone using a Game Boy and probably playing Pokemon Red or Blue. But in 1994, we did get at least a way to play Game Boy games on our Super Nintendo, and that basically opened that audience up to that library of games. And it was an interesting strategy for Nintendo to kind of bring both sides together for this. So what ended up happening was we get this cartridge that, I mean, you can see it looks kind of strange, right? It's a cartridge that then has a cartridge slot to take another cartridge. And if you've ever wondered how the Super Game Boy works, it's the most obvious path. Nintendo just put a Game Boy inside, and we can look at that right now. Just a couple of screws hold this thing together. Once you remove the lid for it, basically, you have two more Phillips head screws that hold the board down. You flip the entire PCB over, and you have a Game Boy CPU looking directly at you. I mean, it's basically the setup that you would need to run Game Boy games as flawless as possible. And I say as possible because the one drawback to the Super Game Boy is it actually runs Game Boy games about 2.5% to 3% faster than the Game Boy itself does. And this has to do with it running off of basically the Super Nintendo's frequency. And while the Game Boy or the Super Game Boy used like the Game Boy CPU and its internals to run the game, it still had to kind of play by the Super Nintendo's rules at that time, as it was outputting video and taking button inputs from the Super Nintendo controller that, hey, lined up once again really well with the Game Boy. Now, this was something that the modding community did fix with use of an oscillator that you put inside of that cartridge, and that way you can technically then use the Super Game Boy, I guess, for speed running or anything. It's a bit easier to capture footage that way, obviously. It also technically fixes some of the audio that was sped up as well, and just the game itself. And the modding community has done some pretty interesting things, I will admit, with the Super Game Boy. One thing in particular that seems kind of unnecessary, but it's one of those why not, I can do it kind of things, is taking the CPU from the Super Game Boy and putting it into a Game Boy handheld. You might be wondering, why would you do that? Well, technically it removes that Nintendo boot screen where you wait for the logo to go from the top to the middle of the screen. That's just eliminated. Like that's kind of it. So I guess if maybe you're a bit impatient waiting for your game to load, go ahead and desolder that chip and then solder it to your Game Boy board and hope it all turns out okay. I have a lot of fond memories of the Super Game Boy. On the Super Nintendo specifically, though, it was just Pokemon. Like, having Pokemon on the screen in your living room was genuinely mind-blowing. One, it looked significantly clearer, and it would also do the fun little borders, and the game itself would be a bit more colorful when you see, for example, Squirtle on the screen. It actually showed up as a blue Pokemon, which, again, going from the monochrome green that I had with my brick Game Boy was like night and day difference. And really, Pokemon itself felt like a game that was too big for the handheld just in the scope, so it fit in pretty well on the Super Nintendo. Let me know down in the comments if it was basically your Pokemon machine, that being the Super Game Boy in the Super Nintendo. I know for me, that cartridge was in there like 80 to 90% of the time during the big Pokemon boom in the late 90s. But there was one major issue with the Super Game Boy when using it for Pokemon, which was, I mean, clearly an incredibly explosive game for Nintendo in terms of popularity and notoriety. There was no link cable port, which is kind of the whole point of Pokemon, was to trade back and forth with your friends. Some Pokemon were only attainable by trading them and then technically hoping your friend wouldn't just run off, Alakazam or Gengar or anything there. So Nintendo, realizing this and understanding that Pokemon was incredibly popular, especially in Japan, set out to make the Super Game Boy 2. And I happened to get one box that you can see here, and I do like the look of the box as they use all different colors around it, kind of blending into that Super Famicom theme. And on the back, you can see them point out that, yes, the link cable does work between a Game Boy Color and the Super Game Boy 2. I guess just don't accidentally try to walk off while that cable's still plugged in, or pull too hard in the middle of a trade, since you could technically kind of rock the cartridge back and forth in your Super Famicom and kind of mess the whole thing up. Inside, we can see the Super Game Boy 2 as well as the manual for it. And as soon as you start going through the manual, you can tell Nintendo basically made this cartridge for Pokemon. It's everywhere. They have screenshots and examples all over the place when it comes to showcasing this device. Now, looking at the Super Game Boy 2 itself, there is one common misconception, and I think it's because of the way this thing looks, where it has this, I think, really, really nice transparent blue shell. People think that it works with Game Boy Color games, and I will admit, that is the step you would sort of expect going from Super Game Boy to Super Game Boy 2. Not at all the case, though. It still just plays your standard cartridges, and technically the cartridges that'll work both in Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Think of like the Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX. But in this case, no. The reason this was created was basically just for that link cable spot. I mean, technically the other part of this is, which we can start opening up here, Nintendo revised it to where the speed difference was eliminated. In fact, this is still, I believe, one of the most accurate ways you can experience a Game Boy game on your TV. Like outright, even compared to like the Game Boy player for the GameCube. People have run tests, and it seems like the Super Game Boy 2 is still the most accurate with how the Game Boy handheld runs these things. It is still the same concept of let's just jam a Game Boy in here, but they did at least mark the CPU a bit differently, I guess maybe to coincide with the alterations they did to make it run the same speed as the Game Boy handheld, and that's SGB2. So otherwise, it's pretty standard fare compared to what we had with the Super Game Boy. They did add some LEDs to it for the link cable slot and just power in general, so you know it was on and you know it was technically reading the cartridge. And because it was only released in Japan, you would have to modify your Super Nintendo slightly. There's like plastic tabs in the cartridge slot, or if you use something like the Super NT, for example, it'll at least just slot in no problem. So keep that in mind. If you're using an American Super Nintendo, you will have to eliminate some of those tabs to make this work. All that said, though, the Super Game Boy 2 is really cool, and in fact, I recommend it to people who maybe hook up their Super Nintendo and still use that Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy 2 is region-free, so you can use any Game Boy game in it, outside of Game Boy Color games, obviously, but it'll play it just fine, and they've added several different things for like the customization side. I'm thinking of the borders, which was a fun thing that the Super Game Boy would do. If you had games that it could read and realize it had a border to display, it would do that. So, for example, with Pokemon Blue or Pokemon Yellow, it would put little borders around it to sort of play into the theme of Pokemon. And otherwise, you had a bunch of different borders you could kind of customize and play around with. For example, you can move from like the Super Game Boy 2 border to gears. You can move to one that's just completely missing the shell for the Game Boy and it's all circuitry around it. You can also go to what's like a very basic paint program inside of it and just start like just take markers and stuff and run all over it and draw what you want. If you leave it sitting, by the way, for like a minute or two, it has that Nintendo quirkiness to it where a janitor will come around and start cleaning all the graffiti off. It'll stay if you kind of press a button and move the cursor around or something, kind of a screensaver there, but it's just something fun to add into it. And through a combination of L and R, which I believe is mostly just L 3 times and then R, you can actually access all of the older Super Game Boy borders. They're present, so you can switch between those and the Super Game Boy 2 border. And again, it's a lot of fun to customize and play around with the stuff that's basically around the game you're playing. But it is something that I've missed from Nintendo's recent offerings with NSO. Having those borders and that little bit of customization, a little extra, does go a long way. And I'm not really sure why Nintendo never released the Super Game Boy 2 in the US or just outside of Japan in general. Technically, it came out at the beginning of '98 before we got Pokemon at all in the US. And after Pokemon came out and just absolutely crushed it when it came to sales charts and popularity and excitement, they were already on to like Pokemon Gold and Silver and then Crystal. And technically the Super Game Boy 2 didn't play Game Boy Color games. That would have been kind of awkward, I guess, to announce to the Western market and then say it doesn't play the newest Pokemon Crystal game. So I guess at that point, Nintendo figured, hey, we'll make it so that the transfer pack plays these different Pokemon games for the 64 and Pokemon Stadium, and then we'll move on to the Game Boy player on the GameCube. But I still think the Super Game Boy 2 is a pretty cool piece to add to the collection. It's not overwhelmingly expensive or anything, and it's pretty easy to find on eBay. But let me know what you guys thought about the Super Game Boy 2 or just the Super Game Boy in general. If you had experience with it back in the day, let me know what your favorite games were on it, or if it was basically a Pokemon machine like it was for me back then. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.